There's a generation in permanent invisibility, not because they're forgettable, but because invisibility is their strategy. They built the internet you're using, but won't post about lunch. They're your manager, who never talks personal. Your parent oddly comfortable with uncertainty. The coworker who fixes anything but never asks for recognition. Born roughly 1965 to 1980, Generation X perfected functioning independently in a world that taught them, repeatedly and without apology, no one was coming to save them. We analyze boomers endlessly. Dissect millennials like lab specimens. Treat Gen Z like a new species requiring study. But Gen X? They're the ghost in the machine. Present everywhere, acknowledged nowhere. Ask them about it. They'll shrug and say they prefer it, because attention in their framework equals vulnerability. And vulnerability got you hurt. Let's establish something critical. Generation X isn't cynical because they're pessimistic. They're realistic because optimism kept getting weaponized against them. They're not emotionally unavailable. They're protective because showing feelings was treated as weakness. They don't avoid asking for help because they're proud. They avoid it because asking meant admitting you couldn't handle what you were supposed to handle alone. And that admission had consequences. Today we're breaking down the specific psychological architecture that defines Generation X, why their brains developed what researchers call defensive independence, how growing up in what psychologists now recognize as systematic neglect created a generation with unmatched self-sufficiency, and why their relationship with technology, authority, and emotional expression looks completely different from every generation before or after them. Because understanding Gen X isn't about nostalgia. It's about recognizing that an entire cohort was psychologically conditioned by circumstances that would be considered child endangerment today, and somehow they turned that into competence. The defining psychological event of Generation X happened every single day after school. The latchkey phenomenon. By 1984, according to research published in the American Journal of Orthopsychiatry, approximately 7 million children between ages 5 and 13 were regularly unsupervised after school. That's not an anomaly. That's an entire generation learning a specific lesson. You are fundamentally on your own. Picture this as your baseline reality. You're 8 years old. You get off the school bus. You walk to an empty house. You use the key hanging around your neck to let yourself in. And then you exist, unsupervised, for 3 to 4 hours until a parent gets home from work. No smartphones, no Ring cameras, no way for anyone to verify you're safe. You make your own snack. You do your homework alone. You solve your own problems because there's literally no one to ask. And your brain, still developing, absorbs this as fundamental truth. Safety is your own responsibility. Psychologists call this environmental conditioning. Your nervous system adapted to an environment where adult supervision was absent by default. And that adaptation became your operating system. You learn to assess risk independently, make decisions without guidance, and handle consequences without intervention. Not because you were mature, because you had no choice. But the unsupervised time did something else neurologically fascinating. It created what behavioral scientists call a high-contingency environment, where actions and outcomes were directly linked without buffer time or parental mediation. You broke something. You dealt with it before parents got home. You got hurt. You cleaned yourself up. You had a problem with another kid. You negotiated it yourself, or the conflict simply continued. There was no one to appeal to, no authority to intervene, no safety net to catch mistakes. This wired Gen X brains for consequence prediction in ways that baffle younger generations. They think 3, 4, 5 steps ahead because their childhood required it. They see second-order effects others miss because their brain was trained to calculate. If I do this, then this happens, which causes this, which results in this. And by the time you're explaining step 2, they're already at step 5, trying to prevent the problem you haven't noticed yet. That's not pessimism. That's pattern recognition from a childhood where consequences were immediate and unavoidable. And while they were learning self-reliance at home, they were learning something equally important about institutions. They lie. Gen X watched their parents' generation believe in organizational loyalty, give decades to companies, follow all the rules, only to get destroyed by corporate restructuring in the 80s and 90s. They watched the social contract, work hard and you'll be taken care of, revealed as complete fiction. They saw divorce rates spike through the 70s and 80s, shattering the stability their parents promised was guaranteed. This created what psychologists identify as institutional skepticism, a deep distrust of any system that promises security in exchange for loyalty. Gen X learned early, companies will lay you off, marriages end, governments lie, and the people telling you everything will be fine are often the ones who benefit from you believing it, so they stopped believing it. They developed backup plans for their backup plans. Not because they're paranoid, but because they've watched seemingly stable things collapse repeatedly. They're not waiting for the rug to be pulled. They're standing next to the rug with their weight distributed so when it moves they don't fall. But perhaps the most distinctive psychological trait Gen X developed is what researchers call embodied problem solving. a belief that with enough mechanical intuition and willingness to get your hands dirty, you can master the physical world. They grew up when things were fixable, not replaceable. Fixable. Your bike chain slipped? You flipped it upside down and figured it out. The TV went fuzzy? You didn't call tech support. You wiggled the antenna, adjusted the cables, gave it a percussive maintenance tap on the side. Things had visible mechanisms, gears you could see, parts you could understand. Cognitive psychologists describe this as developing a mechanical intuition, where repeated physical interaction with repairable objects builds neural pathways for spatial reasoning and causal logic. Gen X learned that broken doesn't mean destroyed. It means you haven't figured out what's wrong yet. And that mindset, that assumption of solvability, transfers to everything. Problems at work, systems that don't function, relationships that aren't working. Their first instinct isn't to replace or abandon, it's to get under the hood and understand the mechanism. They're psychologically wired to believe that with a screwdriver, some patience and willingness to learn, they can fix what's broken. Their relationship with information is fundamentally different because information had cost. Before the internet, knowledge required physical effort, library searches, card catalogs, handwritten notes because photocopying cost money. Cognitive scientists call this effortful encoding, where information requiring work to obtain becomes deeply integrated into long-term memory. When information took an afternoon to acquire, you valued it differently, you owned it, you integrated it. And that's why Gen X seems frustrated when younger generations don't retain anything. It's not about intelligence, it's about the psychological relationship with knowledge itself. They earned what they learned, so they remember it. Let's talk about why Gen X barely exists on social media. Not because they don't understand technology, they built it, but because they fundamentally reject the premise. Gen X grew up when privacy was default. When you made a mistake, maybe 10 people knew. It lived in memory, not on servers. It faded instead of becoming permanent digital evidence. Psychologists studying generational self-disclosure patterns find Gen X demonstrates significantly lower willingness to share personal information publicly. What researchers call strategic invisibility. They learned early, the less people know about you, the less they can use against you. Vulnerability is exposure. Exposure is risk. So they share nothing and think, why would I volunteer to be that visible? Invisibility meant safety, and they'll choose safety every time. But here's where we need to address the shadow side of all this self-reliance, because not every adaptation is healthy, even if it was necessary. Gen X developed what some psychologists call pathological independence, where the inability to ask for help becomes so ingrained that it damages relationships and prevents genuine intimacy. Research in the Journal of Adult Development shows Gen Xers report significantly lower rates of seeking social support during stressful periods, not because they lack people they could ask, but because asking feels like admitting failure. There's a difference between healthy autonomy and defensive isolation. One comes from strength, the other comes from fear. And if you're a Gen Xer reading this, you need to ask yourself honestly, am I self-sufficient because I'm capable? Or am I self-sufficient because depending on anyone feels too dangerous? Because if your childhood taught you that asking for help meant you were weak, that needing support meant you couldn't handle what you should handle alone, that vulnerability always led to abandonment, then your independence isn't freedom, it's a prison you built to protect yourself from rejection. You're still expecting. But for those who develop genuine capability rather than defensive armor, there's something remarkable here. Gen X is the bridge generation. They remember analog, mastered digital. They can fix a carburetor and debug code. They navigated without GPS and built the GPS system. They experienced real boredom, the kind that forces creativity, then created the technology that eliminated boredom for everyone after. Evolutionary psychologists argue this adaptability, this ability to function in radically different technological paradigms, represents unique cognitive flexibility. Gen X didn't just witness the transition from old world to new. They engineered it while remaining psychologically rooted in old world lessons. Don't trust systems, rely on yourself, keep vulnerabilities private, expect nothing. Generation X isn't emotionally unavailable. They're emotionally strategic, not cynical, but empirically informed, not disconnected from modern culture, but choosing not to participate in the performance. They watched institutions that promised stability collapse. They learned the only person you can count on is yourself. They built competence everywhere, because competence was the only insurance that actually paid out. And now they watch younger generations grow up with constant supervision, scheduled activities, digital permanence, parental involvement in everything. Sometimes they worry they gave their kids too much of what they never had, because in the Gen X worldview, struggle builds capacity, discomfort creates resilience. Being left alone to figure things out is how you learn you're capable. You're not broken because you don't share your life online. You're not cold because you don't perform vulnerability for an audience. You're not outdated because you value privacy, competence, and self-reliance over connectivity, performance, and validation. You're someone who learned to survive in conditions that would be considered neglect today and turned that survival into a specific kind of strength. The kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind that just shows up and does the work without needing recognition. Tell me, are you Gen X Or do you recognize these patterns in the Gen Xers in your life? What's the most Gen X thing you've ever witnessed? Drop it in the comments, because maybe the most powerful thing we can do is finally acknowledge a generation that spent their entire existence being overlooked by design. If this explained your parents, your coworker, or yourself in ways you've never been able to articulate, subscribe. We're here to decode the human logic behind our behaviors every week. I'll see you in the next one.